Started and welcome you all to today's panel discussion. The title is U.S. Sanctions on Russia, Objectives, Impacts, and Options. And we're very fortunate to have with us today a set of panelists that can address each of these aspects of the topic. To my left, I'm sorry, let me start with Kyle to my right. If you're going to get the insider's view of how Congress is viewing our objectives when we're talking about sanctions on Russia, I think we can have no better qualified panelist than Kyle. Kyle is a senior professional staff member on the Committee on Foreign Affairs in the House of Representatives. Prior to that position, he served for 8 years on the U.S. Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, dealing with human rights issues in Russia and the former Soviet Union, including, I believe, in the notorious Magnitsky affair, which has figured very prominently in the issue of sanctions. To Kyle's right, we have Sergei Alexishenko. I can think of nobody better qualified to comment on the topic of impacts of these sanctions on their target, Russia, than Sergei. Sergei is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He is also former deputy chairman of Russia's central bank and former deputy minister of finance in Russia, and is director of macroeconomic studies at Moscow's Higher School of Economics. And finally, on the topic of options moving forward, to my left is Dr. Nicholas Gvozdev. Nicholas is a professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. He's also a very familiar face to everyone here at the center, former editor of the National Interest magazine, former senior fellow here at the center. I think we're very fortunate to have these three experts here today. So without further ado, I will turn to Kyle to talk about the topic of objectives and the view from Capitol Hill.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Paul and Dimitri, for the invitation to be here today. Going to give a brief overview, some background and current state of play. It actually is quite timely. We've had very current state of play, including even this morning at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on Sanctions. Our current sanctions framework, the Russia framework, is mostly executive order sanctions that rest on annual renewals of the IEPA national emergency. And then they break out into Crimea sanctions, which for the moment are ill-defined. There's a general understanding of what a Crimea sanction is, but it's not entirely clear. There's a Crimea-specific executive order that comes in December of 2014, but there are also early designations that happen in March and April of 2014 before any fighting in the Donbass breaks out, and so those would have to be considered related to Crimea. And the general Ukraine sanctions, i.e. not Crimea sanctions, are understood to be coordinated with the EU and linked to Minsk implementation. Then we have the cyber order that was amended in late last year, imposing some additional sanctions. That's when the Russians, of course, lost their Maryland Eastern Shore dacha. Also have the Magnitsky Act, human rights sanctions, and a few other related sanctions like some of the Syria sanctions and INCSNA and others that occasionally involve Russians but aren't specifically targeted towards Russia. Pretty much all of these sanctions are SDNs or SSIs. So first, targeted sanctions affecting either specially designated nationals, individuals, or sectoral sanction identification lists, which would again be the sanctions we've heard about with the banking sector, the tech sector, the energy sector, the ban on long-term lending, sort of the biggest one. In this same vein in Congress are a few other, what I would say are not technically sanctions, but should be understood in the same context, in a similar context, and that would be the regular limits imposed on U.S.-Russian cooperation and contact in the military sphere. These happen generally on the National Defense Act. We're in the midst of that right now. I have seen many of the ones being renewed that we've had before, some even strengthened. You have a fair amount of legislative ideas out in the space of countering Russian propaganda, active measures, amending the Foreign Agents Registration Act, as well as something that I guess I would characterize as general INF angst, and that and some of those things look to block or take us out of the Open Skies Treaty, block any START renewal, questions like that. So how does Congress generally view Russia sanctions? Of course, generally there are some outliers, but I think you do have a fairly broad bipartisan consensus. Congress generally likes them. They give Congress a role in foreign policy, and they also appear to cost nothing, which is particularly important in the House, where any legislation you propose, if it has a number amount, has to be scored and offset, which means if your bill scores, it's probably not going anywhere, particularly if it's out of cycle, right? It's not part of the normal appropriations process. You've allocated even $10 million of money for something, then you're not even going to be able to get to markup until you've found who to take that money from. And given what we've all seen with the budget cuts, this is almost impossible in the House. The other feeling is that there's a general feel that the sanctions need to be stronger, need to be expanded. There is a worry that they could be removed, again, because they do rest on the annual renewal of the national emergency. They could even be removed by simply allowing them to lapse. And this was what the outgoing Obama administration sort of addressed when it extended them by a year, to say, instead of them automatically expiring early in the Trump administration, let's push them out and give the new administration some breathing room. In the recent years, there have been some targeting of the sanctions, some linking to human rights, some very clearly dealing with Ukraine, some dealing with hacking. But what we've seen just in the recent few months, beginning of this year, is they're now being grouped in this broad, to address this broad problem of Russian aggression, if you will. So they kind of all fall into that, and that, of course, has plenty of negatives in terms of how you distangle them out and make them more effective. So are they considered effective? I think compared to what, right? They're not. It's not happening in a vacuum. So the question is not generally for Congress is, are these working? But what else could we have done? If you don't like them, what else do you propose? And there are many who feel that if they're not achieving the objective, then they should be stronger. Now, it's also not entirely clear what the objective is, right? Is the objective to stop and reverse? Is it to contain? Is it to bleed and weaken over time? I think it's probably all of these things, and in that sense, I think they're symbolically effective. And one of the things that, whenever Russian officials complain about them, that sort of causes Congress to believe that they might even be more effective. And so it's almost as if the Russians didn't make a big deal about them for a while, Congress might even forget about them for a while. So on the effective question, I know Sergei and others will address this in some depth, but I would just want to call your attention, if you haven't seen it, the recent State Department paper, one of the first unclassified studies at using firm-level data on the effectiveness of particularly the Russia sanctions program. This came out in late December of last year. Chief economist at the Department of State, and the title of the paper, and you can find it online, is Measuring Smartness, Understanding the Economic Impact of Targeted Sanctions. And just to read very briefly from the abstract, the average this were the findings of the study. The average sanctioned company or associated company loses about 1/3 of its operating revenue, over 1/2 of its asset value, and about 1/3 of its employees relative to their non-sanctioned peers. Sanctions have also had a relatively smaller impact on Russia's macroeconomy compared to oil prices, and that the EU hasn't suffered that much economically from sanctions or counter-sanctions, and that most of the suffering has been borne in the countries that have been the most supportive of the sanctions. It's an interesting paper, and I would certainly, anyone who hasn't seen it, pick it up. It's got some great charts in the end, looking at all of this data. So, on the question of what are the prospects of more sanctions or sanctions being removed or codifying existing sanctions, I would say that they're much greater than they were a couple months ago. A couple months ago, I didn't see much prospect at all. A lot of noise, a lot of ideas being thrown around, tons of bills coming out, not a clear focus. But I think news on our domestic front, the investigation, the Comey firing, all of this stuff is increasing the appetite to do something. There's certainly no hesitation on the Democratic side of the aisle to do something, and I think there seems to be a growing sense of some need for maybe preemptive insurance for some Republicans to go in on some of these things and hedge against whatever an investigation might find, or and I don't see that this is going away anytime soon. There's also not much really holding them back. The consensus is pretty broad, and it's very bipartisan, and it's only stopped at the moment by a few gatekeepers in leadership. And as soon as they go or something's allowed to be marked up, it could move quite quickly. The codification efforts that are out there vary in scope from what I would sort of consider very narrow, reasonable codification of limited Crimea sanctions, most notably the Stand for Ukraine Act that passed the House last September, looks only to affect and codify Crimea sanctions. Also tries to define what Crimea sanctions are. Doing this is completely consistent with policy of linking this with the EU and linking this all to Minsk compliance. To the Russia Review Act, which is basically a word swap of the Iran Review Act, and subjects the whole sanctions regime to codification and imposes a termination that essentially, it's a maximalist termination, says that Russia has to cease violating any territorial integrity. So you could not terminate these sanctions without Russia withdrawing from Crimea, without that problem being settled. That is not what Europeans have signed up for, certainly in the current programs. There are a few other bills, but most of them at the moment are, throwing the kitchen sink, cribbing from Iran sanctions drafts. If and when they move, they will change substantially. What would make congressional action more or less likely? I think, again, if we feel like there's an imminent move to rescind them, you would see a congressional reaction. If there's any dramatic escalation of fighting in Ukraine or something like another MH17, or if you actually got to a point where we saw Minsk compliance. But from Congress's perspective, Minsk compliance pretty much means Ukraine controls its eastern border. All the other stuff is going to be details to Congress. If Ukraine controls its eastern border, then Minsk will be considered to be complied with. Should the EU not roll over, that could affect the calculus. Another way that the administration could take the lead on this is proposing a more comprehensive, clear, robust Russia strategy that might include things like sending weapons to Ukraine, increasing presence in the Baltics, abrogating the NATO Founding Act, other things that would, coupled with a strategy to make the case that these sanctions have helped Putin or lead into kind of a rally around the flag effect, might satisfy Congress and be allowed to pass. The election-related investigations are very much affecting the conversation on this. That doesn't seem to be going away. It's quite dysfunctional at the moment, and Russia has really become a domestic issue. So it's not so much Russia expertise that saw it, rather than communications directors and press releasing. A couple concluding points on going forward. Again, this isn't going to end, certainly not in this Congress. I think we're going to see this continue throughout the year, and then next year is a full-blown election, so it's going to come back if it ever even receded. And at least some sanctions are going to be with us for the very long term, and the long term meaning sort of Jackson-Vanik long term. And Congress also is not going to lose its appetite for doing sanctions, so I think the most effective way to approach Congress on this is not so much don't do sanctions, but to help Congress do more effective sanctions, to limit the collateral damage and more focus them. Thanks.
Kyle, thank you very much. You've provided much food for thought, I think, as we continue our discussion. Sergey, one thing I want to note, Sergey is going to have to leave us at 1:30. He has an engagement that requires him to depart, so I will make his apologies here when he has to get up and leave partway through our discussion. Sergey, please.
Thank you, George. I have no engagement. I have a flight. It's a little bit different. Yeah, engagement is better, but flight you cannot skip. I'm flying to New York and then to Russia. Yes, from New York to Russia, because I'm not able to get for 2:30 flight from Washington. No, not at all, not at all. Thank you, Dmitry. Thank you, Dmitry, for this provocative question, and I will try to be as provocative on the U.S. policy vis-à-vis Russia as you are on me. I believe that sanctions do not play any role at the moment. The economic pressure of sanctions has disappeared. There was a lucky moment in the end 2014 when sanctions were imposed, and financial sanctions first of all, and it was combined with the collapse of the oil prices and with the peak season of foreign debt payment by Russian corporate sector. But this is over. This is over, and Russia has passed this period with turmoil on the currency market, with bursting inflation. But afterwards, at the end of 2015, some big companies like Gazprom and Norilsk were able to borrow in the markets. In 2014, initially, when financial sanctions were imposed, no one Russian entity was able to borrow. In 2015, two of them, Norilsk and Gazprom, were able to borrow. In 2016, Russian Federation itself has borrowed, and dozens of companies have borrowed and even raised equity. So financial sanctions are over. There are no new messages from Washington, from State Department, or from Treasury, or from White House. And so today Russia is in integrity as an economy in a whole, is refinancing fully foreign debt. So Russia is borrowing more than it is paying in repayment for foreign debt. So financial sanctions, pressure of financial sanctions have disappeared. In the oil sector, all sanctions were dedicated to Arctic offshore drilling, and those fields are commercially viable only if oil price is above $150 per barrel. That is far from now. And definitely, and the most interesting fact, last week, Rosneft, the company that is under sanctions, have signed comprehensive deal with a set of Italian companies to operate in the Black Sea fields that were under sanctions, and some Americans have left these projects. But nevertheless, Italians came, and nobody paid any attention. So I believe that today, definitely, there is no any concern in Russian political elite. They do not discuss sanctions at all. They do not feel pressure of sanctions. Moreover, they do not see any signals, any messages from Washington or from Brussels saying, okay, we are going to increase sanctions. And that's fine. That's fine. Current status quo is not comfortable, of course, and it is to a certain extent humiliation of Mr. Putin, of Russia, but it's not a harm. It's not a damage to the economy. Step by step, what is not written in sanctions, and I believe if the current status quo remains untouched for, let's say, for a decade, the most important is the sanctions that is not written. It is a ban on transfer of technologies to Russia. In fact, it means that political risk of doing business in Russia have increased dramatically. And it's not a sanction. Business assessing possibilities, assessing risk of doing business in Russia, say, okay, it's not, we're not ready. We're not ready. That prohibits any inflow of foreign direct investments to Russia, and it means that if the current status quo is in place, let's say 10, 15 years, the technological gap between Russia and the rest of the world will widen. And that will make Russian economy less competitive, and living standards will be growing with a much slower speed than in the rest of the world. But in the short run, this year, next year, it's not measurable. So statistically, it's not measurable. And I'm not sure that anyone in Kremlin is worried. Moreover, we have presidential elections in 2018, March next year, and of course, everyone, including Mr. Putin, are looking on elections, but not on 10 years horizon. I do not believe that sanctions have reached their political goal, because sanctions were not able to stop Russian aggression. The most painful sanctions were introduced in end July, beginning of August 2014. Afterwards, Russian-backed separatists launched a very strong offense in Ilovaisk, then in Azov Sea, and in February 2015 they ran offense around Debaltseve, and so it did not stop Russian aggression. And I do not see any reason, military reason or political reason, for Putin to grab some bigger piece of Ukrainian territory, because it will require some occupational army. But nowadays it's a frozen conflict. Putin is happy. Ukraine is destabilized politically, and he may manipulate the political situation in Ukraine to a great extent. And then the most important event of this spring is that a lot of Ukrainian companies owned by Ukrainian businessmen, including owned by Mr. Akhmetov, who is the richest man in Ukraine, were nationalized by separatist republics. And Russia as the country, as the government, officially supports business of those companies. They are metallurgical ferrous companies, and Russia supplies iron ore to those companies, and Russia purchases metals from Russia as the government. Special government agency supplies ore and purchases iron, metal, and steel from those companies. So Russia supports this, and nothing happens. No one in Brussels or in Washington paid attention to this fact. So Russian aggression, it's hybrid war. It's hybrid war. It's taking place in many dimensions. Last year, Russia, for example, has completely blocked transit of Ukrainian goods from Ukraine to Central Asian republics. So Ukraine lost significant amount of its foreign trade, of its export. Okay, no one paid attention. So I believe Putin is happy with current sanctions because they do not harm him. They do not undermine his political authority, and the Russian propaganda machine demonstrates, okay, sanctions is the price Russia has to pay because the United States wants to humiliate Russia, wants to grab our territory, wants to grab our resources, and that's why it's a price Russia is paying for its independence. There is no any facilities for counter-propaganda, and of course, in the country where there are only 3 news TV channels, and all 3 are controlled by the government. Okay, it's a brainwashing machine. It's a brainwashing machine. The interesting question on any congressional move on sanctions. I believe that it's better do nothing rather than to do what is proposed. Put yourself in Putin's shoes. He is to a certain extent scared of possible escalation of sanctions. These rumors emerge from time to time. Okay, there are debates, there are draft legislation, Senator McCain says something. So there are nervous situation. And of course it may happen from time to time because Russia is definitely violating implementation of Minsk agreement. But what can we see from the current draft? Or at least what I have seen. Okay, it's codification. Is codification a serious problem? No, it's your domestic problem. It is the U.S. problem. It is not touching Russia. It's not changing situation. And moreover, as if all efforts of the new wide administration, including new Congress, will result only in codification of sanctions, okay, Putin will very soon decide that current new administration is as weak as the previous one, and will treat U.S. administration as weak. And that's a very dangerous situation, because if Putin believes you are weak, he will behave more cynical in the foreign affairs. Yeah, I would say that what is really worrying me is that sanctions is very important and potentially painful tool of the foreign policy, but it's only one instrument. It's not the single instrument. And by today, there is no any, in my mind, what I see, there is no any policy towards Russia. So nobody in State Department is in charge of Russia. Nobody in the Ministry of Defense is in charge of political Russia. Okay, Russia is not on the radar, so except of these U.S. elections, except their direct comments on. But Russia as a country, Russia and its aggressive policy is not on radars, is not in the agenda. In this situation, codification of sanctions plays nothing, gives nothing. Even vice versa, it will be beneficial for Putin, but not for the U.S. Even if sanctions, it's interesting to compare. It's my imagination, of course. We cannot measure it precisely, but I believe that the pressure of Russian sanctions compared to Iranian sanctions is something like 5 to 7%. So even if you double Russian sanctions, even if you double pressure of Russian sanctions, it will be not 5% of Iranian sanctions, but 10. Russian economy may survive. Putin's regime can survive. So it will not be visible. So either there is a foreign policy, and the goal of this foreign policy is to make Russia leave Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, make Russia speed up in implementation of Minsk agreement. And that means there should be a permanent escalation of sanctions, not necessarily, let's say, new sanctions, but messaging. It should be a consecutive foreign policy dedicating US and Europe, the West, is pressing Russia to implement Minsk agreement as fast as possible, as soon as possible. Otherwise, it will be, okay, it's another frozen conflict, let's negotiate, let's sit at the round table. It will lead nowhere, and that's why I believe it's for Congress. Sorry, it's better to do nothing rather than to do what you are planning. And the last point on long-term sanctions. Let's imagine Putin, for some reasons, after elections, decides to give Donbass back to Ukrainians, to Kiev, and the Minsk agreement is implemented. And what is the rest? What is the residual? Residual is, as Carl rightly mentioned, it's Crimea sanctions. Crimea sanctions, they are funny. They're about nothing. Some Ukrainian and some Crimean people are under personal sanctions, and US companies are prohibited to run business in Crimea, and that's it. Have you heard about any US company that was looking in the recent 25 years to make business in Crimea? No. Can Russia operate in Crimea? Completely. Can Russian central bank or press Visa and MasterCard payment system to provide their services in Crimea? Yes, they can. So if Jackson-Vanik sanctions will be about Crimean sanctions, Putin will applaud you. Thank you. He'll say, okay, it's a relevant price for Crimea. I am ready to pay it twice. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think I talked about the promise of contrasting perspectives on this issue, and I think we're already fulfilling that. Nick, do you have some thoughts on what we might do going forward and how sanctions might relate to this question of broader strategy to Russia, as Sergei has highlighted?
Okay. Mic for me there. Well, thank you very much. Let me just start that since I do work for the Naval War College, that my comments are my own personal observations and don't reflect any official position of U.S. Naval War College or of the Navy in general. The timing of this meeting is fortuitous. I had the opportunity last week to be in Europe. I was able to take part in the inaugural meeting of the LOSIC group, which is a German-American dialogue co-sponsored by the Marshall Center and the Munich Security Conference, and then also while there to be able to meet with a number of European colleagues from different EU member states, and the question of sanctions and Russia policy came up. So I have a bit of an interesting snapshot of at least some of the things that are being said in Europe about this and how it impacts the transatlantic relationship, which then ties into things moving forward. The first thing is that there was broad consensus that when it comes to the European sanctions, that formal lifting of those sanctions is not possible anytime in the near future. The idea that the EU is on the verge of lifting those sanctions, or that countries which have opposed sanctions on Russia will be able to use their veto power, that's not likely to happen. Germany in particular will continue to insist that sanctions be maintained in the absence of any meaningful concessions on the part of the Russians with regard to Ukraine, implementation of Minsk, including the idea that Minsk implementation means Ukrainian control of the eastern border, They don't expect that Russia at any time soon is willing to do that, and so the sense is that the formal sanctions will stay in place. But then the question is, well, what does that mean in terms of policy options? And one thing that was very clear is that while the formal sanctions may not be repealed, there is no appetite for new sanctions, expanded sanctions, stricter sanctions, that the trade-off is for countries like Hungary or Italy or Greece or Cyprus or Spain, which may have issues with the current sanctions. They will agree not to veto continuation of existing sanctions, but they will not permit new sanctions to be imposed on Russia. So if Poland or Sweden or for the months that Britain has left in the EU insist that there should be stronger sanctions on Russia, those countries have made it clear that they will exercise a veto on further sanctions, so that you have a bit of a policy stalemate when it comes to that question. Existing sanctions will stay, new sanctions completely unlikely. When that's also tied into what are the purpose of the sanctions, what is the goal of sanctions? The consensus view that I left with and was said in a number of cases is that the goal of the sanctions is not to collapse the Russian economy. Russia remains too important of a trading partner for Europe, either as a supplier of energy or as an importer of European goods and services. Even with the counter-sanctions in place, it's still an important market for Europe. European companies in particular do not want to lose important gains that they've made in the past 25 years. When it comes to the question of technology, they know that, yes, Chinese knockoffs may not be ready yet, but sooner or later, Chinese companies may be able to offer alternatives particularly of German technology, and they're not anxious to see them cede that field. They are also concerned about the Koreans and the Japanese, perhaps moving in to take greater market share. So there's a sense that sanctions are designed to convey, at least from the European perspective, that they are upset with Russian behavior, that there's certainly a symbolic nature to that, to the sanctions. If the sanctions can help ease a process by which Russia disengages, that's fine. But the idea, and I think this may be a bit of a clash with the U.S. Congress, is stricter sanctions which would lead to serious economic destabilization of Russia do not have supporters in Europe, with a few exceptions. But for the most part, there is not a desire to see Russia thrown into any type of major economic chaos. And that could be a point of divergence in the transatlantic relationship moving forward, simply because the U.S. economy is not dependent on trade with Russia. We don't obtain energy from Russia. It's not a major export market for us. If we were to collapse the Russian economy, I think you'd have some people here who would say, well, what's the problem with that? If it means that Russia can't do things in Ukraine and Syria and elsewhere, for our European colleagues, Russia is seen in a different light. And I think that is an important thing to keep in mind moving forward. There's also, in Europe, Ukraine fatigue. That was something that was very clearly on display, that this is essentially year 25 for Ukrainian reform, that ever since 1991, every year is the year, and there's a sense that, yes, the West cannot lose Ukraine, but does that mean that Ukrainian government officials are doing as much as they could? There's recognition that there has been progress in some areas, but a sense that perhaps Ukraine could be doing more, should have been doing more, and generally a sense of fatigue at the whole question. And among some, not among all, but the further west and south you go in Europe, a sense that it would just be nice if Ukraine would just go away. Obviously, the further east you go in Europe, Ukraine becomes much more of a strategic importance to the countries that are immediately border it. With that, the fourth observation that I left with, and we're already seeing this happen and this was something that a few of the German colleagues were very clear in sidebars on, that moving forward there is going to be much more of a willingness to start granting national interest exceptions to European sanctions on Russia, or perceived European sanctions. That the United States and Europe kind of held together longer than I think some people expected that they would in keeping sanctions imposed, but now Europe has certain needs, and it's time to start revisiting. So whether it's the Italians and Eni getting national interest exceptions to be able to drill in the Black Sea, which of course Exxon applied for here as well and was denied by the Treasury Department. Whether it's the Nord Stream project moving forward, despite objections of some European states, the consortium to, in essence, ensure that Nord Stream 2 is built by 2019, whether it's Statoil and Norway moving ahead with joint drilling for projects in the Arctic, sense that there's going to be a greater willingness to grant, or for countries to grant exceptions. The newest test, of course, is going to be, for those that saw Dmitry Medvedev in Istanbul essentially saying we are interested in connecting the Turkish streamline back with the old South Streamline through southern Europe, and essentially saying to the Bulgarians, here's a chance. You took one for the EU team 3 years ago when Bulgaria essentially put the brakes on the South Streamline. Here's your chance to perhaps restart that project again. And are you going to go to Brussels and, in essence, say Bulgaria, and then with that Hungary and some of the other southern and central European states need to benefit from this project? So that'll be interesting to see. The other question, of course, with sanctions is sanctions enforcement. So you can have sanctions on the books, but what are you going to do about enforcing them? And the question of, are there going to be more blind eyes turned to sanctions not being violated according to the letter, but perhaps the spirit? And so one of the interesting ones, talking to some of our Hungarian colleagues, was the remarkable major increase in Hungarian-Serbian trade for goods that never seemed to cross the Hungarian-Serbian border. In other words, this is a way to get around both EU and then Russian counter-sanctions, is for Serbian intermediaries to be buying goods and services from and to Hungary, and then using Serbia's position outside of the EU as a way to funnel those goods and services. Of course, we all know the famous examples of the last several years of the massive increase in imports to Russia from Belarus of seafood for a country that has no seacoast, which essentially means this was Lithuanian and Latvian and Estonian products that were being sold to Belarus and then re-exported. So the sense that there may be more of this coming in the future, that if my first observation, which is that formal sanctions aren't going to be lifted, are we going to see more creative ways that people move around these sanctions and finding these intermediaries? Same thing again with the mozzarella imports to Russia from San Marino, which have skyrocketed. More mozzarella coming from San Marino into Russia than there are cows in San Marino, which again suggests that this is a way, and that Russia in turn this is a blind eye for Russia to say, look, we are importing, we're not lifting our counter sanctions on the EU, but we recognize that these are goods and services coming from Italy, but we'll live with the fiction that they're coming from San Marino rather than from Italy. More importantly are some of the corporate loopholes that may or may not develop in the near future, in terms of finding where, in particular, Russia and Russian entities now take a very close eye at what the letter of Western sanctions say and then craft around them. So, for example, the Rosneft purchase of the 49% stake in SR Oil in India, which my understanding was that the Indian government queried the U.S., which was, well, does this make this a daughter company of Rosneft? And the ruling was it's not a majority stake, and it's an Indian company domiciled in India under Indian jurisdiction, and therefore sanctions would not apply to SR. If SR wants to float a large loan, it wants to buy technology, things like that, that potentially that would be a way around some of the sanctions that have been imposed on Rosneft itself. Following very interesting the last couple of months, this one company, Rusgas Dobycha, that company made a concerted effort first to at least formally remove one of these sanctioned individuals, Arkady Rotenberg, who disassociated himself from the company, so that you clear that. It's not a private company. It's not sanctioned. It has no bar against raising money. It can go on European capital markets. It has now just been announced they're going to partner with Gazprom for development of gas in Yamal. Its new CEO, I believe, is Artyom Abalensky. Has also been looking at also cultivating Japanese and Korean firms for providing goods and services for development. So that, again, can be a way where Formal sanctions are on the books, but there are ways around it. Of course, what Total has been doing with Yamal over the last number of years as a French company, simply just raising money and financing for Yamal, making sure that that financing never touches EU jurisdiction, raising money in Hong Kong and elsewhere. And then, of course, we have the example of Qatar's sovereign wealth fund buying into Rosneft, which is another, again, another transaction that doesn't touch U.S. or European jurisdiction, but a way for things to move forward. So I think we may see this question of a sanctions regime. Dimitri, if I may use a metaphor that you had used, actually talking about Iraq sanctions in 2002, which is essentially a collapsing network of sanctions. The sanctions are on the book, but enforcement really begins to fall apart, and you have the loopholes opening up, and then it comes back to this question that both Sergei and Kyle have brought up, which is what's the policy? Sanctions can't substitute for policy. And what is it you're trying to achieve? And if the sanctions regime is starting to erode, as it already has, and is continuing to erode moving forward, the U.S. in particular then says, well, do we just accept the erosion and say, well, there's nothing we can do about it? Do we try to tighten the sanctions, knowing that that may lead to a break with our European allies, that there's a point at which they're not going to go further? And then do we start doing what we did with Iran in the 90s, which is we start doing third-party sanctions against our European allies for not doing stronger sanctions on Russia? Do we move to other policy options of statecraft? But ultimately, that rests upon a question which I think will come out more in the discussion, which is not whether sanctions are good or bad or successful or not successful, but what are the policy outcomes we're looking to achieve.
Thank you very much, Nick. Before I open it up to the floor for questions, I will pose one of my own. It's something that all three of our panelists have touched on, but I want to make explicit. One of the things that we think about when we think about sanctions is what are our objectives, what are we trying to achieve, how do we measure progress against those objectives. One that doesn't get as much attention is what about the unintended consequences of sanctions, things that we're not actually trying to achieve, but maybe the fruit of sanctions that are actually doing more harm than good. And in that respect, I was wondering if the panelists could talk about impact of sanctions on Russia-China relations, for example, strategically, in trade, technology transfer, and in finance and investment as well.
Thank you, George. I think that the most unintended consequences of the sanctions, erosion sanctions, is corruption of the Western unity. So as Nicholas said, and I completely agree, it's the erosion of sanctions means that different business companies, banks, they are looking ways to avoid sanctions, or loopholes, or fake schemes, or something like that. And if there is no policy, this erosion will continue and will demonstrate that legal regime may be corrupted, as in Russia, as in the U.S. So that's the most harmful for the U.S. definitely. On China and Chinese relationship, I do not see at the moment that sanctions have changed something significantly. There was a slogan, pivot to the east, immediately after sanctions were imposed on Russia. And Putin himself and his lieutenants said, okay, we don't care about the West, about the Western money, about the Western technology, we'll get everything from the East. But they failed. They failed to the big extent because China is a symbiosis of market and planned economy. And financial sector, banking sector is completely under the control of the government. And if Russian business, Russian economy wants to borrow money in the West, it's go to the markets. And it trade with markets. In China, if you need money, you go to the government. And you bargain with the government, not with banks, not with financial markets. And this is a big difference because all discussions on financing of Russian economy, they are done on political level. They should be in the agenda of the meeting of Putin and President Xi. So it's not very easy. It's not very easy. Of course, Rosneft, Gazprom, some big companies, they're able to raise financing from China but normally it's in marginal amounts. For example, VTB, second biggest bank in Russia, and Sberbank, the biggest bank in Russia, they were able to lend from China less than $1 billion each. So it's not a lot. It's not a lot taking into account their balance sheet size. I think that China has a clear strategy of what China wants from Russia: access to natural resources. Because in the current trade, in the current foreign trade of China and Russia, more than 50% of Russian export is natural resources, maybe 70%. Their share of machinery and equipment, except of weapons, in Russian export is less than 3%. The share of technology equipment of Chinese export to Russia is more than 50%. So China does not treat Russia as a serious competitor, does not treat Russia as a partner in any economic relationship. There are some projects where China says, okay, let's try to build a partnership. Let's you provide some intellectual property, we'll provide our manpower, our technology, our financing, and sell something to the rest of the world, not to China. We don't need Russian goods in China. Let's try to develop something new, and let's try to sell it to India, for example. And there are some projects like another big plane or something like that, but they're marginal. 1, 2, 3 normal projects. So there is no comprehensive partnership between Russian economy and Chinese economy, for example, like between Russian and German economy. So I would say that it is overestimation that Russia has benefited significantly in its pivot to the east.
I think it's a great question, and I think we've been lucky in two regards with the pivot to the east. The first was that in the first year of sanctions, when they had the greatest impact on Russia and Russia was looking eastward, China just didn't take advantage of it. China had an attitude of, well, we just have to wait and we can get all of these Russian assets at fire sale prices and we can impose the terms. And there was a point at which, and certainly with the sale of the Rosneft stake, the Chinese played very hard on that, of, well, we want board seats and we want control over the company. And the idea the Chinese had was that Russia had nowhere else to go and couldn't survive without Chinese help. And I think that the Russians did survive without significant Chinese assistance, and I think that has had an impact there. So I think we were lucky in that regard that Xi Jinping and but more importantly, some of the people around him really thought that they could continue to hold out to they could get more Russian assets at lower prices. The other area where we've been lucky in the pivot to the east is that Putin and the Russian foreign policy establishment have not moved as quickly on the islands dispute with the Japanese, because that really, if the Russians had made major concessions to Abe on that, even in this last visit that Abe had to Sochi, that Abe was continually coming to Russia, was testing certainly the unity of the G7, and you'll have this special economic regime for the islands, and that may pave the way for some greater Russian-Japanese cooperation. But the Putin's unwillingness to really contemplate a major concession on the islands to the Japanese meant that Russia's ability to break Japan out of the G7 consensus on sanctions has been lost. And again, if that, it would have been very difficult for Abe to say, well, we're going to continue sanctions on Russia if the Russians had said we're prepared to make a comprehensive settlement on the islands. So, and again, we've been lucky there as well that hasn't happened. So both the Chinese being short-sighted on bailing out the Russians in 2015, 2016, and then the Russians being short-sighted in terms of because, after all, with having gained Crimea, if they lose the islands, Putin still comes out more on the ledger of, Russia's still larger with Crimea than the loss of the four islands. But
Population too, right?
Population too. So.
And geography.
So in some cases, but I think this also points out an example which I think is important on this question, is that the question of Russia and sanctions isn't something solely decided here in Washington, and it's not that everyone else reacts. We have also benefited from the missteps that others have made on this as well, in Beijing and then in Moscow with regards to Tokyo.
Real quickly, I don't get the sense that there's much concern in Congress about Russia getting too close to China, and a feeling that, you know, the tension in that relationship sort of places some pretty obvious limits on the damage, I guess, to our interests. On unintended consequences, to me, probably one of the biggest is just that sanctions is, you know, kind of a lazy crutch and a substitute for a policy. They're just too easy. The drafts are ready because we were just doing this against Iran, and so it's too tempting for people to reach to them without thinking them through.
Okay, on the right, please identify yourselves before posing your questions.
Untitled Asset Management. I'm just curious to know about U.S. imports of Russian petroleum. The first thing the U.S. did in 1979 with Iran and then later with Libya was to ban the importation of petroleum from those countries. And obviously, in this case, it was exempted. And Russia actually is a top 5 supplier of petroleum to the United States. And actually, after the sanctions, the supply actually even went up slightly. How did that discussion go? What's it like now? Would that be reconsidered? And then related, what about the situation with Citgo? It looks increasingly likely that Rosneft is going to own Citgo, and that's going to make a major problem for the U.S. in terms of, do they exempt that? Does this just make it laughable, the enforcement of sanctions, or what do they do?
Two things. I think one of the obvious reasons is U.S. efforts to minimize unintended impact. I mean, it's the same. You know, we used to have Novatech coming to us saying, "Hey, why are we sanctioned and you know, Gazprom is accepted?" Well, pretty obvious, because you're smaller. We can hit you harder without affecting or, you know, damaging things with Europe and other things, and also the political notion of doing something that could be seen as raising prices at the pump or anything like that is just a non-starter. So we'll put carve-outs in there. On the Rosneft question, that's something that Congress is paying attention to, and I think there's a view that of pushing the administration, whether through conversations or enacting law. Currently some draft stuff on Venezuela. That would be its determination, essentially say that Rosneft doesn't have collateral for the loan because they couldn't take the Citgo assets if in a default.
Ambassador Burt.
Yeah, I have just a general comment, very quick, and then a couple of questions. But my general comment is I was also recently with a group of Russians and Germans in St. Petersburg, and discussing amongst a variety of issues, the sanctions issue. And what struck me were really two things. One, the Russians really don't want to talk about sanctions at this point. They've either decided that if they complain too much, it will send the message that they're somehow being heard, or they feel that they've adjusted to the reality of the existing sanctions and can live and work through them. I tend to think it's more the latter, and particularly if you look at where their economy is going now and the adjustments they've made and the kind of macroeconomic management that's being put into effect. I have a sense that they've decided there's a new normal, if you will, that the existing sanctions regime is based on. What was also, though, interesting, though, was the sense that the one aspect of the sanctions that are now in place with the Russians that would disturb them the most is if they were forced to get rid of their reverse sanctions, their sanctions against imports from the United States and Europe, and particularly in the agricultural area, because the agricultural sector right now is the fastest growing part of the Russian economy. And so it just shows, if you will, one of the really interesting unintended consequences. But for my questions, first on the role of the Congress. I mean, does the Congress really understand, particularly in the terms of the options being examined on the Senate side with the different bills that are under consideration and so on, that these sanctions just really don't matter if the Europeans don't go along. I mean, before the Ukrainian sanctions, Ukrainian-related sanctions were put into place, U.S. trade with Russia, as you probably know, was less than Russian trade with Belgium. And so, you know, unless you can bring the Europeans on board a broad new approach to sanctions, particularly in the case of energy, and I know some of one of the Senate bills is designed to really kill Nord Stream 2, which is really not an attack so much against Russia as against Germany. And, you know, I think politically, if the United States wants to declare economic war against Germany, and at the same time play around with border adjustment tax and other import restrictions on German cars, we're going to find ourselves with Germany as an enemy, not Russia as an adversary. So I'm wondering how realistic the Congress is in thinking about bringing the Europeans, and particularly the Germans, on board here. And then to Nicholas, in terms of, and a number of people have talked about Minsk, but you know, again, it's a question I think could go to you, Nicholas, as well as going back to the Congress, is that people talk about the failure of the Russians to implement Minsk. But you know, anybody that looks closely at that problem knows it's not only the Russians that are guilty in not implementing Minsk. You know, I think if you look at the terms of the Minsk agreement, I don't see today how any Ukrainian government in Kiev could muster the political support for the kind of autonomy and political decentralization that would be required to bring basically self-rule to the Donbass. I don't think that is politically possible given Ukrainian politics today. And my understanding of what's happening internally in Ukraine is it's going to become more difficult, not less difficult, to implement an agreement like Minsk. So that really raises the broader and bigger question is, do we need to be a little more creative in terms of thinking about a solution for Ukraine? Is the Minsk process the only solution available to us? And that just raises this bigger question of how do you have or justify and sustain support for a sanctions policy when we don't really seem to have a consensus on a Russia policy?
Quickly on the question of the Senate bills, I think it's a mistake to read any of these pieces of legislation that closely or take the individual provisions terribly seriously. They're rushed together again. They're pulled from various ideas that ended up in Iran sanctions, the menu of options. They're pulled from Senator Corker's own draft, the Russian Aggression Prevention Act of 2014. If and when there's movement or there's a leadership dam that breaks, the provisions will change dramatically, is my sense, because that's when you get Congress actually being forced to pay substantive attention to this, because then we're going to have the Europeans are going to be contacting, industry's going to come through, and the shape of the bill is going to move. These were markers thrown out there, kind of just marking territory, so that when the market calls for the product, hey, it's ours, let's repackage it and move it along.
I think the questions on Ukraine that you've raised beg a larger question, which is, what is the end state that we want in the West? One of the things when I was in Europe, in the meetings we started doing, let's do some future scenarios. What would happen if? So one of the ones that I threw out is, all right, what happens if a government, you get Nadia Savchenko gets elected president of Ukraine, the pilot who was held in Russia is a political figure now. And you get a consensus that says, look, Donbass is deindustrialized, it's depopulated, it's just territory nobody wants anymore, and Crimea, we've probably effectively lost it. So this is what we're going to do in Ukraine. We are going to accept the loss of Crimea and Donbass, but then in so doing, we will now say, well, we now have no territorial problems with our neighbors, so we'd like to move on the Bucharest promise of admission to NATO. And you kind of had the pin drop, particularly among some of our European colleagues, because, no one ever wants Bucharest to ever be acted upon, right? And as long as Ukraine and Georgia, for that matter, have prolonged territorial disputes, it's the it's the excuse that gets us off the hook for not having to bring them into NATO to act on the promise in Bucharest that, yes, eventually you'll be in. But, I mean, that does raise the question, which is, is Minsk process, relations with Russia, I mean, what ultimately is the end state that is acceptable to us? Maximally acceptable and minimally acceptable in Ukraine. And I don't know what that is. So I don't know what we would accept as an acceptable end state. We've had for years neutralization, Finlandization of Ukraine. It's a bridge between East and West. It doesn't belong to either, and yet no one politically seems to want to move on that. So if you did get Minsk, if the Ukrainians did start implementing Minsk more, but then it still begs the question, well, then what? So what would they, because the Ukrainians, I think, would say, all right, if we're implementing it, what are we getting from it now? What is it, if we do these things for you, the West, that gets you off the hook on your policy towards Russia, then what do we get out of it? And the same thing, I think, with Russia as well, which is, all right, if Russia moves on Minsk, then what does Russia get? Does Russia get something? Or, one of the things that was said with sanctions is how quickly would sanctions on Russia that are imposed on Ukraine be reimposed because of Syria? That, okay, you've complied on Minsk, but, now we have problems with what you're doing in Syria, so unfortunately we can't lift sanctions on you because, we now have a new set of issues. And I think that partially why neither the Ukrainians nor the Russians are moving on Minsk, partly it's, as you said, the domestic politics don't allow it, but I also think that in both capitals there's a sense of, if we move on these things, then what? And in the absence of a clear, certainly a transatlantic consensus, and then in the absence of a clear U.S. consensus on what to do, you're going to stick with a unpleasant status quo that's familiar, rather than take steps and find out that you don't have you're moving into an uncertain future. So I think everyone is learning to adapt. Russia's learning to adapt to sanctions, which I think, as you said, your observation, that they can live with sanctions. I think Ukraine and Ukrainian politics is learning to adapt to not having Crimea and having this, no war, no peace situation in the East. And the Europeans are learning to live with, what this does for the Eastern Partnership. So I actually don't think you actually have any pressure to really move beyond what we have now, unless something were to change. And I don't know, Kyle, you kind of talked at the beginning that there are certain steps that something might happen that might lead to a change. So, but I don't know if we're at anywhere near those conditions yet.
Jacob.
Jacob Heilbrand from the National Interest. My question is for Kyle. I don't think I'm divulging any secrets when I say that there is a new piece on the National Interest website at the top, written by one Nicholas Gvozdev, that just went up. And the title is, "Trump is Not Budging on NATO." Now, Nick took a fairly benign view of this, but your comments about Congress prompt me to wonder. When Trump refuses to make the rhetorical sop on Article 5 about NATO today and goes out of his way to shove an elbow, essentially, into NATO, how does that affect what you were talking about in Congress? The optics, the perception of Trump. Is he, in fact, from his own viewpoint, perversely undermining himself with that kind of action? Or does it not matter? As far as when you were talking about Congress trying to prepare for a tougher line on Russia in the event that something happens. So I'm wondering, does Trump in fact draw excessive attention to himself and his problems with that kind of action, which may feel emotionally satisfying to him, but is it in fact, in policy terms, or counterproductive for his own standing?
Jacob, I mean, for the benefit of people, including what did Trump do or not do today in his remarks on NATO?
He did not reaffirm the Article 5 mutual defense, which the White House yesterday apparently said he would. So by not saying something, he got more attention than if he had said something. I don't think it would have been that big a deal.
I think you're right, Jacob. I think I mean, see how this is received in Republican quarters in the Congress. I'd sort of feel like saying, well, we're working on them, we'll get them there. There's a feeling of saying, hey, don't pay too much attention to this. The team is good. All these other questions, give it some time. I think, NATO is much more important than to Congress than the Russia sanctions question, than Ukraine. And one of the things I think there's been sort of a little bit of an effort with Congress to try to shift, say, hey, it's okay if you bash the EU, sort of for every dollar you take out of the EU's pocket, we want to put two in NATO's pocket. See if there's some way we can aggrandize NATO at the expense of the EU, and so, yeah, it's something also in recent European travels. Congress has traveled a lot this year to Europe, and it's no accident. And in all of the meetings, it's all been as if everybody is pretending and carrying on as usual. We haven't heard a whole lot of worry or complaint from Europeans, and no one from our side has let on that anything isn't, A-OK and normal. And just to hope that perhaps if we carry that on long enough, maybe it will happen in fact.
But does it make people?
But it doesn't make it doesn't put Republicans in an easier place. No, absolutely not. Nor does we were hearing, this was now a month or so ago, but we were hearing there was discussion at the NSC at some level that if they were to remove sanctions, the sanctions that they were looking at as sort of an olive branch to Russia were going to be the election sanctions that were imposed in December. Now, of course, as far as sanctions go, these are really nothing. But in terms of really inflaming Congress, that would be worse than had you said, hey, we're going to take away all the Donbass sanctions. Tone deafness.
Sorry, in the red? No? Did you have a question? Yes. Sure. Okay.
Amy Conroy, Chevron. I have a question for Kyle, and this kind of goes along with Ambassador Burt's question. How does Congress react to, or how do you think Congress react to the argument that codifying sanctions takes away any impetus for Putin to actually withdraw from Ukraine and fulfill the Minsk agreements? And also was hoping you could maybe add a little bit more about today's bill that went markup and kind of where you see that going.
With the Post story, Senator Shaheen's bill?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so two things. One, Congress reacts differently to that, right? I think the House has taken, and again, I'm part of the House effort, so has taken a more measured approach in the last Congress in this bill, this Stand for Ukraine Act, which is really a very careful codification of Crimea sanctions only, and was meant to also be a message to Russia that preserving full flexibility, that should Minsk be complied with, the administration should have full flexibility. There is definitely the possibility of sanctions relief, but we want to sort of fence in the Crimea piece, not because the Crimea sanctions necessarily, for their obvious value, but for the value of the principle. That the one thing that can't be lost in all of this is we need to preserve this notion that you can't make territorial changes by force alone, and of course. You could still maintain that even if you dropped the Crimea sanctions. It would be a powerful blow to morale, but ultimately the key thing here is that you don't recognize, and you keep talking about Russia's occupation. So when you look at the Senate efforts, again, the Senate Russia Review Act is a word swap of the Iran Review Act. And, part of it, I think, is a certain playing of politics and putting politicians in certain difficult places because it was Corker's bill on Iran. So to say, hey, what if we just go through here and we swap Russia for Iran and use the exact same language and say, are you for it now? Well, it's if you don't have an opportunity to get in the details, it's maybe an awkward place to be. You could get in the details and say, well, Russia and Iran are different, and we're talking about an agreement that was being put before the Senate on the Iran deal, and you don't have that in the Russia case. And, oh, by the way, you're subjecting the whole sanctions regime to a termination that says Russia gets out of Crimea is a massive departure from where we all have been with the EU, that Minsk doesn't deal with Crimea. Crimea sanctions are not on the table. No one said they are. But the rest of the sanctions, which include the biggest sanctions, are very much on the table if there's Minsk compliance. So, when you look at the Russia Review Act, that's not the bill that I would expect to move. What I expect to move is the Cardin bill from January 11th. That you actually have some serious Republican support on. Number 2 Republican in the Senate is on it, and that's the one that will be rejiggered and moved around and has all the Nord Stream stuff and you know, the kitchen sink in there. And this morning what happened was that Senator Shaheen was going to offer an amendment to some of the bills that were there, and I think the way it turned out was an agreement to withdraw with a tentative commitment on the part of the chairman to consider and to move sanctions bill at a future markup post conversations with the administration. So again, I think there's a pressure to move this, and on the House side this morning, we also got one step closer to moving sanctions legislation that would be election related. So there's pressure, and that's why I said I certainly could see it possible that the Senate and the House end up by the end of the year passing separate sanctions bills that relieve the pressure to do something but don't really end up anywhere. Because I don't think there's much appetite in the House for the Senate bill and vice versa.
The broad-based Cardin bill, you think it's getting possibly ready to move? You think that's getting...
It's getting ready to say, hey, let's take a look and mark this up. Meaning, when the time comes, if you look at this as Republicans in the Senate feeling pressure to do something, the product they're going to look at and use is going to be the Cardin bill.
But that's the most broad-based.
That is 57 pages long. It is the most broad-based bill, but that doesn't assure you of anything of what it looks like post markup. So many things could be changed in this, and again, the way it's written now, it's a non-starter in the House. It has massive amounts of money allocated. The House won't even entertain that. Plus, generally speaking, the House has much more of an eye for the details in sanctions legislation than it does than the Senate does. The House is much, far more willing to listen to OFAC and to hear out the arguments of Treasury, whereas the Senate more of a big picture thing of, hey, just give me a sanctions bill. We want some sanctions on things that need to be tougher than the sanctions we have. And then staff scramble to say, hey, who's going to do this? And well, we've got this stuff we already wrote.
Best sanctions bill ever.
That's sanctions bill.
Yes.
Thanks. Oren Durrell, USA Today. This is a very interesting conversation, and I'm wondering, first of all, what's a realistic outcome in terms of what sanctions can achieve, and what would the price be? What would it take? And tied into that is this issue of petroleum, Russia's petroleum sales. What would it take to break Europe's dependence on Russian oil and gas? It was kind of part of the same question. Then my other question is, in light of there's this big Russian military buildup on Russia's western border with hundreds of tanks, and people are saying it's not a defensive kind of buildup. Does that increase the receptivity in Europe for doing something? And I guess that comes back to the what would it take question with regards to to sanctions.
The first part of the question again, what would it take?
Yeah, what would it take? What is the outcome that the United States should be looking for with regards to Russia? And
on the sanctions front, what are the sanctions designed?
Yeah, and what would it take in terms of sanctions? I mean, what in general, what's the policy? Because I think Nicholas was talking about policy and saying that we need a policy. What should the policy be? What would it take to get it?
I don't think I haven't heard anyone in Congress think that more sanctions, even really draconian sanctions, will cause Russia to turn around and back out of Ukraine. So I don't really think that that's the goal. I think there's a goal of saying, hey, you talk about being a frozen conflict. Well, fighting in the recent month or so has been a lot more than it's been since 2015. So it's not entirely frozen. But a frozen conflict is not the worst possibility for Ukraine either. There was a time where people worried about Kiev. They were worried about Mariupol and a land bridge to Crimea. So part of the goal is status quo, is to maintain this, to strengthen the Ukrainians so that they can at least hold the line of contact, don't lose things like they did the Debaltseve pocket. And then another big part of the goal, and perhaps just as important, is sort of a monkey wrench in the works to ensure that things don't get better that in U.S.-Russian relations rhetorically until they actually get better in fact. Sort of saying, hey, this is one way to keep this all on the agenda. Is it effective? It's effective at keeping us all talking about it until we've come up with something better. As far as the energy question, I think that's really been one of the brighter spots in the past decade of you know, Europe is not there yet, but there have been incredible advances towards greater energy security from a variety of things, including LNG and pipelines and connectors and interconnectors that are being built. And on the Russian military buildup, does that cause the Europeans? My sense is that it causes the Europeans to think that we shouldn't put anything more in the Baltics, lest we really get these guys angry. So I don't know that it actually provokes a response to say, hey, we really need to meet this, soldier for soldier.
Okay, I've got a number on the list. Wayne Mary, I think you're next.
Thank you. Wayne Mary, the American Foreign Policy Council. Kyle, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the thinking on the Hill on legislated limitations on defense and military contacts. What do they actually seek to achieve by that? Because even during the worst years of the Cold War, the Congress did not do that. I mean, in fact, I remember having worked on the Hill in the worst years of the Cold War, that there was a view that having the generals on both sides communicating each other was intrinsically a good thing. And it is certainly true that defense and military contacts during the 1980s played a critical role in help bringing about the end of the Cold War and so on and so on and so forth. Can you talk a little bit about what the mentality is on the Hill about actually legislating limits on defense and military relations?
I'll try. I will say that these limitations are not things that I, from where I sit, or even the Foreign Affairs Committee has been involved in advancing. But we are in the chain of clearance on the National Defense Act, which we do jointly with the Armed Services Committee. So most of these things come to us already having been written in there by members of the Armed Services Committee. And then we, in order to sign off on them, are often in the process of negotiating in waivers and saying, hey, wait a second, my sense is that part of the reason to do these is again, hey, I'm a member of Congress, I got to do something about Russia, I got to have something of my own that I can say I've done and I've limited, and this is again one of those ideas like sanctions that's always out there. But I don't entirely understand it, and generally in the final analysis we're able to build in enough reasonable waivers that contact that happens and that needs to happen is still able to happen, but not always. There have been some cases where we do end up with legal prohibitions to do things that I think many people, particularly at the Pentagon, would say, hey, this is very much in our interest to do.
In the corner? Yes.
Paul Starobin for the Russia Matters project at Harvard. Nick, you brought up Bucharest and this sort of forgotten idea that one day NATO might be expanded to include Ukraine and Georgia. So do you see any prospects of that from the soundings that you've been doing, including in Europe? And talk a little bit about, just to cast that out, what might be Putin's response, the Kremlin's response, should any sort of motion in that direction begin to take traction?
I thought what was interesting was the extent to which, in some of my conversations with Georgia, there was a sense of, relief that you have a Georgian leadership that just isn't pressing the door on this, right? And again, it's this idea, which I think is extremely unfair to both Ukraine and Georgia, that they have to be the ones to get the West off the hook for things that the West was unwilling to say no for. In other words, we weren't willing to say, nope, we really don't want you in NATO because of all the complications it's going to create, but it has to look like it's your idea not to come into the alliance. And I don't know how sustainable that is for Ukraine, given what's happened now. Georgia, it's interesting to see this evolution of a Georgian leadership which remains committed to Georgia's European integration and transatlantic integration, but seems to be much more pragmatic in how it pursues it and in terms of really rebuilding relationships with Russia that the previous Georgian administration had ruptured. But again, it comes down to this question of, we keep circling back to it, which is, well, what is the end state that everyone is willing to live with? And if the end state is that, well, Russia should have, the position has been is that Russia should have no veto on what its neighbors do. If its neighbors want to come into NATO, then that's their choice to do so. And then Russia's response is to say, well, it's our sovereign choice to do things that create problems for our neighbors because they're doing things that we don't like, and therefore we'll continue to do it. I mean, with Ukraine, you say, well, what more can, they've already done a great deal. I mean, what happened in Ukraine in 2014 and 2015 follows very much on what Putin told Bush in Bucharest in 2008 about Ukraine and NATO. He said, if you try to bring Ukraine into NATO, then Ukraine will shatter. So, again, it's one of those things where I think he says things and we don't listen because we don't want to listen, or we just think he's bluffing, or, just like his spring speech that he gave right after the annexation of Crimea. That should be a speech that should be mandatory reading. If you want to think about what motivates Putin's worldview, read the speech he gives about the annexation of Crimea. And he talks about you compress a spring, and you keep compressing on it, and sooner or later the spring bounces back. And I take him at his word. If he says that, if that's his thinking, then either if you're going to compress the spring, you better be prepared for the spring back, or you have to do things to make sure that the spring can't spring back. But then we hit up what Kyle said, which is we have a policy of we want to do something as long as it doesn't cost us anything. And there are things we could do vis-a-vis Russia to bring, say, well, Bucharest was a sacred commitment. We say Georgia and Ukraine ought to be in the alliance. But they impose costs that we're not willing to pay. And our European allies certainly aren't willing to pay it. And again, this argument before about, what the interesting thing about Germany, let me go back to that, which I think is, ties into what's happening with NATO today. It's with President Trump's visit there is a sense that the U.S. is looking to disengage from the day-to-day security issues of Europe. It would prefer that Germany carry more of the burden. Germany doesn't yet have the capabilities to do that, but it is developing them. But we'll also run up into a problem is what happens when Germany, if we say to Germany, as we've done with Ukraine for the last several years, we outsourced a lot of our Ukraine policy to Germany, but then we get mad when the Germans don't pursue the policy outcomes that we want them to. So then don't outsource them to Germany. Then do it, we didn't have to do the Normandy format for Ukraine. We could have stepped in. We told the Germans and the French to do it, and then we don't like what they do. But that same thing coming back to your point about NATO, which is that the Europeans would really not like to have this problem be visited on them, and we'll have to make a call.
Is there a next one or two things you see Putin doing? Should it be advanced in that direction?
That if we were to try to continue to push, then yeah, I think that if you think that Ukraine is having troubles now, I think that the Russians would continue to accelerate, and they would look for ways, just as what they've been able to do in Moldova. Moldova is teetering on the brink, and Moldova's on the verge of being split into its three constituent parts. And so, yeah, these are fragile states that can be shattered, and we're not going to be around to pick up the pieces. So, Belarus may be the next ground as well. It's another panel to have.
Paul Saunders.
And I'll pass it back. So I'm not the biggest fan of sanctions, but I'm also not a big fan of policies that don't work. And what I mean by that is, if we're going to have sanctions, why not have sanctions that do something, that achieve concrete objectives? And there are two questions when you think about that. One is, what is the target of your sanctions, and the other is, what is your policy objective, which we've been talking about. If you really want Russia to get to change its conduct, you have to impose, or I would say more accurately, threaten to impose fairly significant sanctions on something that matters to Russia, and you also have to have a policy objective that's an achievable objective, something that Russia would reasonably do. And I guess as I look at Russia, setting aside, for the moment, the Ukraine question, which is a very complex question, and it's not easy for me to envision sanctions that the United States would reasonably impose that would get Russia to change its behavior. There are a lot of other areas in the U.S.-Russia relationship where I can envision sanctions playing a useful role. Kyle, you and I have talked before about Russian conduct toward American companies, for example. There are concerns about corruption in a variety of different Russian government institutions. I would certainly include the central bank, and I'm sorry that Sergei left, because it would be interesting to have his perspective on that. Do you think there would be, Kyle, any appetite in the Congress for really focused and significant sanctions bills that might encourage Russia actually to do concrete things to change its behavior in that area, in the economic area? And I guess related to that, do you think that members of Congress understand that in order to use the sanctions as leverage in this way, it requires kind of having a credible bill and then moving forward, but actually being prepared to pull back, when or if the Russians do what we want them to do?
That's not generally how it works in Congress, Paul.
I was afraid of.
And just my experience watching sanctions bills, that you have the problem that they're supposed to address. So they come out of the gates swinging real strong, and then the problem gets worse, and the sanctions get weaker as industry and Treasury and state and other people kind of come into the conversation. But there's a feeling of, hey, we've been doing this, right? So because ultimately, what is policy making about? It's about winning, right? We got this product, we got to get it across the line. Doesn't matter if it no longer addresses the problem, or and you've got these outside constituencies that have rallied around the cause and set up websites and have sent postcards, and they can't be disappointed. And so it's very difficult. The other thing, I guess the other question on the economic front, the corruption front, there's a lot more attention being paid to that area. That is, there are ideas going around. I don't know if they'd be strong enough that would look at some of that, and certainly Russia wouldn't be the only country, but it is a major focus. Some of them involve kind of taking these tier designations that we've seen in, for example, trafficking in persons, where you call upon the State Department to grade the world, to put all the countries of the world into 3 categories. Tier 1 is you're basically doing what you need to be doing. Tier 2 is, hey, you're making efforts, but you're not there. Tier 2 watch list, you're really slipping. Tier 3, you're totally not doing anything at all, ignoring this problem, and then that's going to trigger certain sanctions that, of course, are waivable. On the corruption front, you would kind of try to look at a tiering where, Tier 3 sanctions might look like, okay, you're now going to face a presumption of illicit finance, that any dollar you bring into the U.S. economy to spend on image laundering or lobbyists or real estate will be presumed to have been stolen from your country unless you can prove otherwise. And in some cases where First Amendment concerns and other things preclude stopping the activity, then we would impose total transparency on the activity. So you would look at amending FARA and other things to say it's no longer a portion of your time spent, it's any money spent. Shine your name in lights, you're on this list. Now this is stuff, we've seen this where you have, I for a while was being lobbied by agents of Gennady Timchenko, but you'd never be able to find that out because it was all registered under Ivanyan and Partners, which was a law firm in Germany, and was a cutout in Airfix, the airline, and so saying, hey, isn't this exactly what Congress wanted to get at when it says, hey, there should be transparency in these conversations? So there is an attempt to do that. I have more of a stomach for it because it places us in line with a large swaths of the Russian street. And this is something we tried to do with the Magnitsky Act, was to say that, when we're talking about corruption and sort of using Navalny's successful branding of United Russia as the party of thieves and crooks, we're on the same side as the Russian liberals and the Russian nationalists to say we don't like these thieves and crooks because they're hurting Russia, right? There's essentially this, as Navalny says, Putin is the biggest, anti-Russian leader or whatever because he kills Russian people and he stashes his money abroad and things like that. But something along those lines to where we have a much greater ability to resonate than we do if we're talking about religious freedom or certain parts of human rights. You'd say, hey, there's quite a bit of difference in view on the Russian street on these questions.
Okay, we're running very close to our deadline here. Bob, Mary, Toby, and I think there was one other question as well. No? Okay.
I'm Bob Mary. I'm with the American Conservative Magazine. I really appreciate the conversation here, in part because I've been trying to figure out for a long time, and one of the reasons I came is to understand what this is all about, and so far I feel sort of like a failure. Sergei talked about how these sanctions have had almost no impact. Nick can't seem to find a tie between these sanctions and policy. Mr. Parker, I was struck by your description of them as being, quote, symbolically effective, which has a certain Orwellian ring to it, but I think understandable in terms of course, understood. So I found myself wondering when you were talking about how Congress would react harshly if any of these sanctions, even the election sanctions, which are almost nothing,
especially the election sanctions,
were to be pulled off, right? Maybe that what this is all about is purely domestic consumption. Is this just basically a feel-good thing to make us all feel like we're doing something in the face of those rascally Russians? And
you said it, not I.
That's the question.
I think we have an answer. Toby.
I know there's always a tendency to want to do something. It's a very American tendency. I used to think it was a congressional tendency too. I'm not sure anymore. But to me, the sanctions that have the most impact are the ones that have an uncertain impact. It's not the certainty, it's the uncertainty, because banks don't like risk. Companies don't want to go in if there's a possibility of risk. And that's really, I think, the biggest point I would make. When you talk about sanctions, for example, in energy, I wouldn't look at the sanctions in the Arctic and stuff for $150 a barrel oil. The Arctic is an infrastructure boondoggle. It's a port, road construction, and we know who gets those kind of contracts. I don't really think it's about energy, frankly. But the thing that has to be done is the renovation of the West Siberian fields. And that's where the Russians really need the technology. And I don't know where they're going to get it from. Part of it maybe from the Chinese. The thing that also has upset the Russians the most about our sanctions, believe it or not, is their inability to use their 2 summer resorts. It's the one that really grates on them the most. And that, I think, you can understand because it affects the people who make policy the most. The people who are rich go to their, wherever they go, in whatever country. But it's and I've heard this a lot when I've been in Russia. So those are my comments. My questions are the following. You talked about sanctions legislation very narrowly, But we also have sanctions legislation being considered on two other areas. One is Syria, where Iran, Syria, and Russia would be sanctioned, whatever that means, for human rights, crimes against humanity. And the second is North Korea, where we have threatened to have a regime where we will interdict and board ships we think are going to North Korea. Well, if you've been reading recently, Russia policy towards North Korea has expanded. In point of fact, coal's being sold. They opened up some kind of free trade zone. Do you include those under sanctions? And, well, whether you do or not, can you talk about the status of those?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mentioned them at the outset as we have this sanctions regime that is the 4 executive orders plus the revised executive order on cyber, which is usually seen as the Russia sanctions regime. Then you have these other things out there, some statutory, some executive order. You've got Magnitsky human rights sanctions. You've got the recently House-passed Syria Caesar bill, which, correct, if you read it, it is essentially a Russia sanctions bill, right, with a Syria name on it. And then you have all these other programs, the Iran-North Korea Sanctions Act, and things like that are happening. This was the reason. This was essentially Chairman Royce's answer this morning to Democratic members saying, "Hey, here it is, late May, and we haven't done anything Russia sanctions related to address the elections conduct." One of the things Chairman Royce did throw out was that, listen, we just a week or so ago passed this big Syria bill that is really a Russia sanctions bill. As far as the prospects for that bill, it's something that the House is deeply committed to. Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel are it's their bill. They also passed it in the House last Congress, and it went nowhere in the Senate. So it's a real question of where that goes. I think it's possible that it could move in the Senate, but it was one of the things for some reason that Corker towards the end of last session. It was that bill and our Ukraine codification that stalled out, and I didn't hear a whole lot of explanations that made a whole lot of sense as to why that happened.
Great. Well, thank you all. We have reached the limits of our discussion for today. Thanks to Kyle and Nicholas, our panelists, and Sergey and Abstentia. And thank you all for coming.